See, there are other guests.
Yeah,
So,
someone else still coming in.
yeah. So wait a second. Let me make it.
No problem.
So.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Wait a second. Antonella, I'm so sorry I can't find now your bio. And I wanted to, I need to go. That's why I wanted to stop. Let me see. Is it recording?
It is recording.
Okay, let's start again. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Antonella Valeo from York University, who's gonna talk about corrective feedback today. And Antonella Valeo is associate professor at York University, where she teaches graduate courses in applied linguistics, TESOL, and English second language. Her research examines language acquisition and classroom-based interaction with a focus on corrective feedback and language teacher education and development. So join me in welcoming Antonella Valeo, Professor Antonella Valeo, for today's session of the Research Colloquium. Thank you, Antonella, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Enrica. Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and just confirm for me, please, that what you see is a single slide, yes?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Great. All right, so just give me a moment to get set up here as well. Out of the way. All right, so thank you very much, Enrica, for your introduction and for inviting me here today. And my thanks to all of you also for your patience in postponing my visit from last week. I was a little bit froggy, but certainly was much appreciated that you were willing to do that. So as you know, the area of research I'll be talking about today is corrective feedback, and my particular interest is in looking at this area through an ecological lens that foregrounds context. And I'm going to unpack all that in the next 45 minutes or so. My goal today, though, is not to share new research with you, but to leave you hopefully excited about an alternative perspective to future research. And the focus is not so much on answers that we have, the findings of our research, but rather a focus on the questions that we ask. So in preparation for today, I know that Enrica asked you to read a chapter from a book, The Handbook of Corrective Feedback. And the goal of that chapter was to examine classroom-based research, that is research that takes place in intact classrooms that pre-exist researchers and the research agenda. So this chapter foregrounded the role of context as a critical feature of classroom-based research. And today, I'm going to build on that premise to describe a framework that may help us understand how context intersects with and at the same time brings together various dimensions of our research, not only research concerned with corrective feedback, but more broadly with teaching and learning as well. Okay. So I won't begin with the definition of corrective feedback because I think it's a topic that's familiar to any of us who learned a language as an adult or taught in a language classroom. But I will say here, though, that I see the practice, the place, and the act of corrective feedback as intuitively a part of teaching and learning. And for me, I would describe it as an intimate relationship. I know it may sound a bit over the top to some of you, but it's something that does speak to me quite strongly. And as learners, we remember being corrected, and generally we have strong feelings about it. We either hate it, we feel crippled by it, or we love it and we see it as a critical part of our learning. As teachers, we form our positions fairly quickly too, though sometimes through conflicted and tortuous kind of relationships. And we are in fact rarely indifferent, either as learners or teachers. We all have something to say on the topic. So it's no surprise then that this should also be a preoccupation for researchers from some of the early work over 40 years ago until now, when research in corrective feedback is arguably one of the fastest growing areas of research in applied linguistics and language teaching and learning. And so I'd like to talk today about how this area has been treated in research. with a view to its relevance to pedagogy and the classroom, where corrective feedback lives. For me, that's how I piece them together. So we're going to take a tour of the corrective feedback research, and we're going to look at where it came from, how it has moved and transformed, where it seems to be headed, and why the phrase I mentioned in my abstract, "it depends," is so important. And again, the focus of this tour will be less on what we know and more on what questions we've asked along the way. And I'll point out a few of my favorite sources that I recommend, but did not require for you to read for today, for which I understand you are very grateful. So you're welcome. Certainly it's not a comprehensive review of any kind, but I would like to recommend a few kind of touch points for you. So we'll begin with some questions, and it may surprise you or not, perhaps, to know that over the past 40 years or so of research in corrective feedback, we've actually continued to ask many of the same questions. And to a large extent, we've even come up with the same answers. So let's go back to one of my favorite early sources, an article by Hendrickson. It dates back to 1978 and is titled "Error Correction in Foreign Language Teaching, Recent Theory, Research and Practice." And this is certainly one of the works that you often will hear of referred to as seminal. Let's start by noting the title. It's not corrective feedback, but error correction. So already this suggests a different perspective on errors and the role of teaching and learning. Error correction suggests that once the teacher provides a correction to the error, the deed is done. There seems to be little place for the role of learner, who's assumed to accept it. Corrective feedback, on the other hand, suggests a more interactive move in which the teacher provides feedback, alerting the learner to an error, provide an opportunity for a response that may or may not be a revised correct version. Now, those are very kind of technical descriptions of both, but certainly we can appreciate that to look at this as error correction is coming from a somewhat of a different place than corrective feedback. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Hendrickson didn't imagine a role for learners, but the perspective is the difference in these terms is noteworthy. And so while I said that we continue to ask the same questions, to a large extent, this doesn't mean that we always looked at them the same way. And we'll see that as we move through the tour. Now, in this paper, Hendrickson posed 5 questions and reviewed the handful of studies, which he describes as scant, in fact, that existed at the time to come up with some answers found in research. So the first one makes no assumptions. It asks, should learner errors be corrected? And while this may seem strange to some of you who perhaps have been trained and academically grew up, let's say, in an area or with the thought that error correction was something we all do. In fact, even today, to some degree, this question continues. We're going to see that. I will come back to that later. The second question, premised on a positive reply to the first, asks, if so, when should learner errors be corrected? Should a teacher give feedback immediately after every error, or wait until the conditions are better suited? Should they correct every error every time, only some of the errors particular times? And some of this was concerned with the impact on student confidence and questions around how perfect language needed to be. You can see that from 1978, these questions are still very familiar to us. The third question was, which learner errors should be corrected? This question was concerned with a distinction between more serious or less serious errors. The idea behind errors that impeded communication or perhaps were somehow unacceptable. The fourth question, how should learner errors be corrected? And this is the question that has come to dominate both the research agenda, though I'm not convinced that it's the most important questions for teachers. More on that later, and certainly was the most compelling at the time. This is the question that asks, should I tell the learner what they did wrong, explain it, give them the right version, or should I just hint that something is wrong and let them figure it out, or something in between? Now, the final question who should correct learner errors? Is it necessarily the teacher, or is there value in peer correction? So Hendrickson responds to these questions by examining the literature at the time, and that literature was largely descriptive. It reported on what teachers do and what was recommended in the literature at the time. There's very little empirical research going on, but he responds in this way. So for the first question, yes, there's wide agreement that there's benefit for learners when teachers provide error correction, and thank goodness, or the entire agenda would be lost and the questions would stop here. So we've settled that part. And then with regard to the other questions, Hendrickson concludes as follows. It's not necessary nor beneficial to correct all errors, but he does note that there's little empirical evidence to support any position. Some errors are more important to correct than others, specifically errors that impede communication, contribute to social stigma because they're somehow unacceptable, and those that occur frequently. Now you can see that that's still a pretty big stretch. It also appears that direct approaches are not as effective. That actually did come from one of the empirical studies that was available at the time. We'll talk later about what that means exactly. And that peer correction may be more valuable for some students than others. So 1978, let's see where we're headed. He also concludes broadly, a review of the literature on error correction in foreign language teaching reveals that no current standards exist on whether, when, which, or how student errors should be corrected or who should correct them. There are a few widely accepted linguistic criteria of grammatical and lexical correction in foreign language teaching, and much of what has been published on error correction is speculative and needs to be validated by a great deal of empirical experimentation. Now, what's interesting about these statements is that as we move forward, you will find that, in fact, some of them still hold true today. But let's see where we're headed. So this is a good time for us to take a step back and look at a very specific body of research that I described in the chapter that you were asked to read. In that chapter, I talked about descriptive studies. And descriptive studies, these are actually important to me because they're situated where, my favorite phrase, where corrective feedback lives in the classroom. And in the chapter, I noted to you that in answering, or rather in Hendrickson's paper, in answering some of the questions that he posed, he drew on some of this descriptive research, not the same that I quote in the chapter to you, but what existed. And he cites some early work that documented through observation how teachers in classrooms corrected learner errors. And out of this, the aim was to create a kind of taxonomy that described these practices. Now, building on this work, I'll draw your attention to the work of Lister and Ranta. You'll see the categorization, the image on the left. And this work was actually created 2 decades later. And in this seminal paper by Lister and Ranta, we are introduced to a categorization, a typology that identifies 6 different strategies that teachers in the classrooms in which the study took place used to provide corrective feedback. We also learned that one of them, recast, is a particular favorite. And the paper has a number of other findings as well, but I won't focus entirely on those. Now, while the typology was concerned with oral feedback, you'll see on the right a similar typology for writing that was created by Ellis years later in 2009. Again, this should be familiar from the chapter that you read before this. Both were important in that they created a roadmap for us to make sense, a researcher's sense of what teachers were actually doing in the messiness of the classroom, in their interaction with learners, and naming what teachers do, and in this naming, allowing us to compare the strategies and respond to one of the key questions driving much of the corrective feedback research: which works best? So essentially, the reason I focus on this particular event is because it did actually support a huge burgeoning of literature, empirical studies specifically, that came ahead of this. Just give me a second. Okay. So as this body of research moved forward, some distinctions emerged that are relevant to both the spoken and the written context. And the distinction for one of them, relevant to both, but certainly the first one I'm going to note, is between strategies that were explicit in nature, clear indication of the error, correct version, perhaps an explanation, and those that were implicit in nature, suggesting, including the suggestion that something is not quite right, or repeating the statement but correctly, with no overt indication of what the error might be. And these kind of strategies were detailed in the typology by Lister and Grantham, and in terms of written corrective feedback by Ellis as well. Now, another distinction here is between input providing and output promoting, where some strategies gave the learner the correct version and others tried to elicit the correction from them. And these distinctions are important steps forward in corrective feedback research for a number of reasons. I'll focus on two here. Firstly, they transform a typology into a taxonomy. And by doing so, what they do is they empower researchers to investigate and understand the processes of teaching and learning. So with the typology, they can certainly identify different categories and say, let's look at this one, let's look at that one. But at this point, with these distinctions, what researchers can also do is look more closely at the processes that underpin each. And note also that they represent a continuum. So they're not dichotomous. There are no strategies that are entirely only explicit, but they may be more explicit than others. And certainly there isn't a direct, or rather a cutoff point between any of these distinctions. And for me, this is important because it acknowledges the fluid conditions of the classroom, the complexity of teacher decision-making, and the organic nature of what we do when we teach. This is an example of how some of these strategies are placed within this. I didn't show this to you earlier because I don't want you to take it as being discrete places, but you can see that there are some strategies that are considered implicit input providing, others that are implicit output providing, and in this way, these distinctions create a taxonomy. So, oral corrective feedback, let's have a look at this for a moment. It can be explicit or implicit, and it's not quite such a clear dichotomy. See this example. Right? Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a bird. Okay. So from the perspective of the teacher, perhaps it seems highly explicit and emotional. From the perspective of the learner, we're not quite sure if it is in fact that explicit. So for example, like information is missing. Why should I never end a sentence with a bird? You can see that there is a different perspective happening here. Right? I'll give you another example. Breakfast at the Grammar Cafe. Would you like those eggs over easy or over easily? Now, in this case, this isn't a situation in which we don't know, for example, what the customer said. But again, you can see that there's some ambiguity here. There's a suggestion that this is somehow implicit, that the language is just being prompted. But in fact, it all depends on the perspective of the other interlocutor, the customer, the learner in our cases. So just to give you a sense of how, in fact, this continuum plays out in our classrooms and in life. Let's have a look at similarly corrective feedback in writing. Okay, so in writing, there's a distinction that's made between direct and indirect. Okay? And these are different ways in which the distinction is realized. And I'll show you examples of it in a moment. Likewise, there's a distinction between focused and unfocused. In this case, a distinction between selecting an error or one, maybe a few errors that we're going to focus on in a written piece, or correcting all the errors. And these are the kind of decisions we make all the time as teachers. For example, here are some samples for us to look at, and each of them show that in fact they're not dichotomous. So for example, the sample that's up in the left-hand corner, certainly it appears direct, but at the same time, it's coded. And in that sense, it's indirect. So it is more, it is less direct perhaps than the one next to it, but not as direct, or rather not as direct as the one next to it, but less so than the other. If you look at the one on the right-hand side, it appears to be not only direct, but unfocused. Now, we can't be sure because we're not entirely sure what the expectation was in terms of the person, the writer, the learner receiving this. And the one at the bottom appears to be indirect, but completely unfocused as well. And again, we're not sure because we don't know what the intent was. So all of this is to say that we can certainly identify different ways of providing feedback. We can create a typology, but in the end, it's really about how it's being interpreted, how it's being suggested and directed. So fast forward, what do we know now? Okay, so the first question, and here, by the way, I draw on a number of different reviews and meta-analyses, but I'm not going to cite them throughout. I will at the end instead give you a list of sources that I drew much of these comments from, okay? And so for the first question, why correct feedback at all? Well, hooray, okay, it's widely agreed upon by researchers, this time through a range of empirical studies, that corrective feedback is valuable. And despite assertions that corrective feedback is not only ineffective, but downright harmful. Okay? Some of you are familiar with this by the scholar Truscott. Truscott's assertions, in fact, rather than kill the corrective feedback research agenda, served to spur more research, just to prove the point, but better research, more empirically sound. And that's a whole other story that we can talk about. Now, Truscott, interestingly, also echoed one of Hendrickson's observations from the literature way back in '78, that teachers usually don't know what they're doing when they give corrective feedback anyway. And I put that very crudely. Basically, the observation was, that's familiar to all of us, that they're inconsistent, we are inconsistent, spontaneous, their practice is guided by intuition versus technique. And the last one is, this last statement is intuitively appealing to researchers, I believe, because it positions them as those who can tell teachers how to do it right. And this is relevant to our own concerns with context and ecology as well. So with regard to the other questions that were part of Hendrickson's world and have endured throughout, there is evidence that explicit strategies tend to promote greater gains than implicit strategies. You can see here the language of empirical work, right? Greater gains. There also appears to be greater advantages to responding to selected errors over all errors. There may be benefits to both immediate and delayed corrective feedback. And there appear to be benefits for corrective feedback provided by peers. So you can see I purposely did choose to highlight tend to, appears to, may be benefits, and appear to be benefits. And in summary, I like this phrase quite a bit. Teachers, in the end, need to make choices in accordance with linguistic targets, interactional context, students' age and proficiency, and the classroom's communicative orientation and curricular objectives. In other words, it depends. And this comes to the point of our discussion. Now, before I get deeper into corrective feedback, I want to step back a little bit. And I'd like to illustrate the kind of situation we're in, not just for corrective feedback, but for research generally, with a simple question. Okay? Imagine that you want to know whether you should have an apple or an orange for breakfast every morning. So how would you go about answering that question? Initially, I had hoped that perhaps I could get some answers from you in the chat, but I see this is going to strain my technological prowess tonight. So I think we're going to leave that. But nevertheless, so your question, which one? So I suppose you could analyze the nutrients, right? That's a place many of us would go to. Okay, let's see what an orange has, what an apple has. And then, of course, with that data, you might try to track it against some kind of document that indicates what our dietary needs are, and come up with some conclusions around which one should be eaten. Now, all this is very familiar to those of you who might have spent time wading through empirical research. But for our purposes today, I'd like to raise a few other questions around it that are not likely new to many of you, but that we don't tend to necessarily think of immediately. For example, simple, who set the recommended dietary requirements? We all have our feelings about the Canada Food Guide. So if that's the go-to, then that's a question for you. And this content analysis, the nutrition facts, how well do we know, or to what degree do we know that those are actually accurate? Now, those are kind of, I'm going to put this very almost superficial kind of critiques, though, in many ways, because underlying all this, there are assumptions that fruit is good for you, assumptions that breakfast is good for you, that everyone likes apples and oranges, and everyone has equal access to apples and oranges. In fact, deeply rooted in our individual preferences are all of these kind of questions. They're rooted in our individual ideas, but also the broader social, economic, political, and cultural context in which we live. Breakfast in some places means something quite different from breakfast in another. And it even means something different for us from day to day, over time, over space and place. So we can see that our notions of food, whether it's breakfast or fruit, are deeply personal. They're rooted in our individual cultures, shaped by our experiences of the moment and over time. And by no means are they the same today as they were yesterday. So the question becomes, if we can see this with this, why do we not understand this when we think about our teaching, and in particular about a strategy like corrective feedback? Okay, that was my fun. I'm going to get back to work now. So in essence, we can agree context matters. Okay, and that's the main premise of this talk. So as the past 4 decades of research unfolded, researchers were not entirely ignorant of the role of context. I certainly don't want to suggest that I have come on the scene and suddenly made this up. I would just suggest that it was still neglectful. And as you read in the chapter, there have been calls over the decades for more attention to context in research in general, and corrective feedback in particular, and certainly more recently, a more heightened sense. Now, the early descriptive work of Lister and Ranta that I mentioned was carried out in a very specific context, content focused as opposed to language focused, French immersion with children and in Canada. And so the very context of that study raised questions around how dimensions of context mediate teacher practice and learner responses to corrective feedback. And subsequent studies across a range of program contexts, including German language immersion, English language programs in Hong Kong, Japanese immersion in the US, have tried to examine the same kind of context. And they have found similarities, but also differences, not surprising. Now, intuitively, when many of us think of context, this is where we go, the distinction between second language and foreign language, right? And our pedagogical training is grounded in the distinction between ESL, EFL as English language teachers, for those of us who are, and many programs specialize in one or the other. They identify themselves as such. Even TESOL programs do. However, increasingly, we've come to realize that this distinction is not a neat, clean dichotomy. English in Quebec, is it ESL or EFL? French in Ontario, is it FSL or FFL? And the comparison immediately highlights what is not intuitive about this distinction, the fact that these definitions reflect social, political dimensions that complexify and blur the distinction. And along with that, any conclusions we can make about research and its implications for teaching and learning. This, of course, is not limited to the teaching of English or Canada, but can be seen around the world. An interesting study by Lee, for example, highlights the role of the social political context in a study that examined teacher beliefs and practices in feedback, related to feedback in the context of Hong Kong, and described how teacher decision-making was mediated through a conflicting relationship between teachers' pedagogical knowledge and an exam-focused institutional policy. I know this is not new to many of us. We've certainly been there and seen that play out in other contexts. And experimental research has examined the efficacy of corrective feedback in different contexts. In particular, for example, one study that I found very interesting that in fact has not been, I won't say replicated, but even expanded upon, is by Bichner and Noch, who looked at learning outcomes related to corrective feedback in classes with international students versus newcomers. And for me, that's particularly interesting because the newcomer context is pretty much neglected in our research. Research widely tends to take place in higher education contexts with university students. So that's a whole other area of discussion. So what's the problem? Well, despite these calls and the selected studies to date, context, I would suggest, still remains neglected, or at least still remains a black box for those of us who are trying to understand what's going on. And I'd like to focus on why this is the case and suggest that one issue is in part methodological. And methodologically, the body of research we're looking at is hampered by a dominant focus on assessing the impact of a specific strategy, such as providing grammatical explanations on a specific language feature, like the use of the past tense. The use of the past tense is a favorite in corrective feedback research, by the way, for a lot of reasons, I'm sure. Excuse me. Now, this has continued despite early calls for greater attention to how corrective feedback is understood and enacted upon in the classroom. And I choose the word enacted purposely because increasingly, I don't consider corrective feedback to be implemented or applied, or even, well, sometimes I consider it to be taking place. But certainly, I do think that there's something to be said for considering how it's enacted upon. And pointing out that research on learners' errors in terms of type, frequency, and the errors that teachers correct and evaluate is not sufficient if we want to find out what types of adjustments and interaction are beneficial to L2 development. This is from Van Leer, and you'll be hearing more about Van Leer in a moment. More recently, Ellis also points out that how we document and understand corrective feedback in the classroom is problematic because studies assume the legitimacy of coding corrective feedback in terms of the general corrective strategies, which is problematic. For example, researchers document the use of corrective feedback by isolating specific strategies within instruction. Back to our typology. So while we all got very excited because we thought, aha, we know what they're doing, we can name it, and now we can study it. In many ways, that initial place created a bit of a box for us. and has led us to look only at that one spot, and in fact, to isolate it. Now, this is where I get a little bit excited, okay? And certainly there's broad agreement then that context matters, that research which purposely investigates the mediating role of contextual variables is needed. How then can we understand the notion of context and somehow draw on it to help us understand what is going on in the classroom? And I'm going to bring in here the work of psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And some of you may actually know his work better than I, but I discovered it over the past summer and got quite excited by it. And specifically his 1979 book, The Ecology of Human Development. And his work may be, as I said, more familiar to some of you, and certainly is seminal, but does come from psychology, and so bridges over to where we are. And in particular, it was made relevant by Leo van Leer, as I said, a linguist that we'll be looking at also today. So in his work, Bronfenbrenner questioned the way child development was being studied at the time, with particular criticism for the laboratory settings that were used to carry out controlled experiments of child behaviors. Studies that he described as investigating the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults. In other words, conditions that were so far removed from anything natural to the life of the child as to be completely divorced from the ecological environment, and in this way seriously threatening its relevancy. Now, in response to this, he proposed a framework designed to draw attention to the ecological dimensions, the contexts in which children develop, and which can lead us to examine and account for the various contextual dimensions to ask different questions. So he conceptualized this ecological environment as a set of nested structures, like a set of Russian dolls. Now, I seem to be missing a slide. Interesting. All right, nevertheless, so what is not here is a visual that I intended to show you that basically captures a number of circles. And the inner circle is the immediate setting, the home, the classroom, the local. And this he identified as the microsystem. So I'm sorry, I'm going to strain your attention a little bit because you don't have the visual. That slide chose to go home. At a broader level, it opens up, and the next level is about the structures such as the school, the immediate community. And he termed that the mesosystem. Still broader, we find an exosystem that operated at the level of academic, social, or professional communities. And so you can see that there are multiple levels in the environment. Now, the key piece in his work is not so much these multiple levels, but the bigger one, the macro system, because Bronfenbrenner's work was concerned with how the macro system signified the relationships between the other systems, the relationships between home, the community, and the broader context. And this relationship was really mediated through patterns that reflect underlying ideological systems, basically our beliefs and values. Beliefs and values, they're embedded across interaction. In other words, the individual is engaging with other individuals across these contexts, and this interaction is mediated by the complexity of our beliefs and values. Okay. I'm going to move now, and we'll come back to that, to a little bit closer to the classroom. Leo van Leer, some of you are very familiar with his work, I'm sure. an influential scholar and linguist, brought the work of Bronfenbrenner to applied linguistics. In many ways, he's credited with this and in transforming how we look at what we do in the classroom. And again, you can see I spent the summer with some very old material. So I got very excited over a 1988 book of his, The Classroom and the Language Learner. And in this book, he drew attention to the classroom as a kind of ecosystem for learning. And Van Leer describes the educational context as messy and complex and called for an ecological perspective that recognizes the variability, diversity, and non-linear nature of learning that characterizes the language classroom. This is all very familiar to us. We understand that that's what classrooms are about. And Van Leer valued in Bronfenbrenner's model, again, not so much the model of nested systems, but the relationships among the system, the linkages that allow the researcher to track instigative and debilitative forces between one ecosystem and another. And he proposed that classroom research must study not only how classrooms must or should be structured in order to promote learning in optimal ways, but also why things in classrooms happen the way they do. And in this way, expose complex relationships between individual participants, the classrooms, and the style to forces that influence it. He also notes, interesting enough, that researchers consider dimensions of context, and in doing so, they create challenging conditions for themselves, in that much research that decides to be looking at context will actually decide what context variables to look at. And the notion that context is described as variables is significant. He suggests that in fact, all aspects are relevant. So let's go a little bit closer to home. What does context mean to us? How do we identify dimensions, components, variables, all the moving parts that make up context, relevant to an instance of corrective feedback? This design that you see here would have been the kind of visual that you would have seen for Bronfenbrenner's work, but I will give Enrica the PDF and it'll have that missing slide in it. So take this example of an exchange of corrective feedback. Okay, this is a little snippet that might exist in a study. The learner says, I complete the form. The teacher replies, oh, you completed the form, okay. Or the teacher might say, what did you do with the form? Or maybe not complete, completed, it was yesterday. Okay? So these are all three different examples of potential responses, and you saw earlier, they all represent different strategies, okay, from much more implicit to explicit, from input providing to output prompting. Now the question becomes, what contextual dimensions would we consider relevant to this exchange? Once again, I had hoped to hear it from you, but I'll throw out a few myself. So we have this notion of the 2 minutes in which this is happening in the classroom. But in those 2 minutes, there's a great deal more, right? There's the 2 minutes before, there's the half hour before, there's the morning, there's also what's coming up ahead. So in terms of time, there's that. There's also the contextual dimensions that we can more closely document. For example, what is the task? What is the lesson? The syllabus, the curriculum, the actual institution, the employer, the funder, the community. So you can see that we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have yet to touch on the contextual features that are part of individuals, part of the learners community and where they came from. Not so much in terms of an origin, but even their homes, and also the teachers. So this is, by no means is it easy to be doing this, but my goal is really to help us start to think a little bit bigger. So what does this mean for us as researchers, teachers, and users of corrective feedback? We need to begin by unpacking and to some extent deconstructing what we think we know, to question our conceptions of context and the way in which it consists of components, dimensions, relationships. At a basic level, this urges us to consider who is actually experiencing the corrective feedback that takes place in our classrooms. We continue to examine feedback as a dialogic process, teacher to learner, but are increasingly aware of the role of the other learners and how each person in the room contributes to creating opportunities for corrective feedback. And we need to recognize that making errors, responding to errors, providing feedback on errors, excuse me, and responding to it are all behaviors that are embedded in the broader classroom interaction, something which now increasingly is becoming a focus with the work of Nasaji and others. And this brings me to the point that what goes on in the classroom, though to some degree is planned by the teacher, is essentially constructed during interaction between learners, the teacher, learners, and learners. And that all of this is influenced by what every individual in this interaction is bringing with them. An important feature too of this construction is that the context is essentially defined by the participants, their own perspectives and realities. This makes it a bit challenging because it means if you're going to try to find out what the social political context is, are you going to be reading the history of English language teaching in Quebec, or will you be actually examining what the participants think the context is? And to give you an example, I'll give you an example from some of my previous practice. I spent a number of years observing teachers in classrooms, primarily for the purpose of evaluation. And my specialty at the time was to observe content-based, occupation-specific programs. And so I worked with teachers teaching engineering, early childhood education, business, accounting, factory floor, automotive work, a slew of different occupations. And in each of these classrooms, if you ask the teacher what kind of feedback they gave, some of them might be able to tell you, some of them not. But I always think of a number of cases, in fact, many of them, where the classrooms were so content oriented, in fact, taught by individuals who came to the profession not as language teachers, but as professionals in those contexts. They were engineers who turned to language teaching, for example. And if you ask them about their feedback, they might actually tell you that they don't provide feedback at all. This was certainly the case with one instructor that I worked very closely with. Now, if you observe recasts in the classroom, which were the dominant preferred style of feedback, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what was happening. So the learner would say, I completed the form yesterday. The teacher would reply, oh, you completed the form, and then continue with the discussion. So if you ask that teacher if they provided corrective feedback, they will say no, because they didn't intend to do so. Their discourse was not intended as corrective feedback by them. It was simply part of the conversation, part of the discourse. So the question becomes, are we studying corrective feedback being provided by the teacher, or in fact observing classroom interaction that in itself creates opportunities for feedback? Now, I know this might give you a bit of a headache sometimes, so don't think too long on it, okay? But I think you see my point that maybe we shouldn't assume that what we're looking at is, or rather that we know what we're seeing, okay? And a particular feature of context that's not as widely acknowledged, in fact, is temporal, and that every instance that occurs in the classroom, as I said earlier, is related to what has occurred before and what comes later. And I'm not talking about just the conversation, but recognition that what took place that morning has an impact on what's going on in the classroom. So I'm going to come back to where I started. I was talking about questions. And this is what I'd like to leave you with, the importance of the question. So as researchers, we need to break away from places and practices that restrict what we see around us and how we ask questions about what we see. Broadly, the focus on context has potential to show us not what is wrong, what problems there are, but what the strong points are that we can build on, as opposed to weak points. Now, I don't mean so much at corrective feedback strategies or inquiry as to what works, but more around what's going on in the classroom in such a way that we can draw on that interaction, on that context, and use those instances as places to foster this kind of growth. So what does this mean for corrective research, corrective feedback research moving forward? Well, consider how what appears as an instance of corrective feedback is embedded within the classroom. What's happened? What happened before this? What will happen next? And more importantly, why did this happen? Who was part of it? What did they bring to it? How will they change it? Because they do change it. And consider also how context changes. In particular, what's a classroom? I brought this up at the chapter towards the end, if you recall, when I was querying the next conception of what a classroom is. Is a classroom the space we share? And how do we choose to share it? And in fact, our experiences in the past 2 years of this pandemic should have questioned our understanding of what a classroom is, not only in the simpler way of moving from a physical shared space to a virtual one, but also in terms of what the value of each is. So many of us are asking what we've lost, what we've gained. How would this discussion be different if we were together in the OISE building today? For me, certainly very different. You will see my body continuing to move as I sit here. And how would all this affect how we engage, interact as teachers and learners and a community? So essentially, what does it mean to share a physical space, to invest in that space and the experience? Okay, now I can't believe my voice held out. I'm going to end the session with just a few more minutes because I would like to talk a little bit about the references and suggested reading. Excuse me. So as I said earlier, my intent was not to be citing different work, but to give you a broad picture. But I did choose a few that I'd recommend to you, and that also certainly provided for me much of this information. And one is another oldie, an article by Allwright in 1975. This was one of the first articles that really started looking at the classroom. And today I still read it, to be honest, and I still enjoy reading it. So if you have an interest, I would suggest that. There is the Bronfenbrenner book, 1979. The Ellis 2009 typology that I described, another article by Ellis from 2017, which gives a neat kind of overview of something similar to what I just did. And in fact, what he does is he looks at Hendrickson's paper and tracks where we've come with that. So that's a very readable paper. The Hendrickson paper itself, 1978, and a few reviews and meta-analyses that allow us to come up with different kind of statements about where we are. One by Kangen Han, Karim and Asaji, Lee and Bono, and the Lister and Ranta paper, the seminal paper that describes the typology. Another review by Lister Sato Sato, and the handbook. This handbook, I promote it not just because I'm in it, but because it really is an amazing resource. And in fact, I have adopted it as the course text for the corrective feedback course that I teach at York. So I'd really recommend it. The other item here is actually a special issue of the TESOL Canada Journal that Eva Kartkava and myself put together in 2020. And I mention it because the goal of that issue was to foreground context. I'm taking it a step further today but that was part of my own kind of exploration. It was something I wanted to be putting out there. So you'll see that it contains a number of articles on corrective feedback in different contexts. And then of course, the 3 references from Leo van Leer, the original book, 2004 and 1997 article as well. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonella, for this great talk, and so clear, so comprehensive, and also I really appreciated that you gave also a chronological development of the field. So I'm stopping now the recording.